Today I'm going to be telling you the story of the time I was hospitalized at 21 years old. Now, this is a pretty rare occurrence, which is why I thought I should get into it. It all started one day when I had a weird feeling in my lung, and it was just like this slight pinch. It wasn't anything major. Now, this was 3 years ago in 2021. I was doing homeschool at this point because the school year had started before the COVID vaccine had come along, and long story short, I was staying at home. So thankfully, I wasn't away at college while this was happening. But I told my mom about this little feeling, and she was concerned enough that I had to go to a clinic. And this is early in the morning, around 6 o'clock, and I know I'm going to have a long day ahead of me, essentially. So I show up there. You have to call to get in at this point in time. It's like this whole operation. It's already a little jarring right from the get go. We're wearing masks. The nurse who sees me eventually thinks I'm the sweetest baby ever because they don't usually see a 21-year-old in this instance. Usually it's old people. She presses on my midsection and I don't feel anything, which is a bad thing. It's because that leads her to believe it's a blood clot. So she sends me right to the hospital, but we get to drive ourselves and everything. There's no ambulance. So at this point, I'm not quite panicking, but I'm definitely very concerned. I know people who are young can die of blood clots. Like, I've heard of instances of it happening, and it's something that I had researched before going to the clinic. Obviously, you start Googling and try to figure out what's wrong with you, and one of the things that came up is that millions of young people die of blood clots, of course. So I get there and it's immediately very intense. This is during COVID era, so when they do intakes, it's, scrutinizing, and they have to check my temperature. I have to pull my mask down. The nurse who was taking my temperature immediately goes, I'm like, whoa, I'm in the big time now. This is not the clinic anymore. And it's really uncomfortable. I have to take my shirt off. I think I got down to my boxers even. They put this little robe on you. And again, the nurse who sees me is like, oh my God, how old are you? You're like a little kid when you're 21 in a hospital. Not to be condescending, like I know I'm only a few years older, but that's just how it is. He's like, honey,
Sit back, no, sit back, lay back.
I'm just like, oh my God, like how am I this embarrassing? Like I feel like I just don't know what I'm doing at all. They hook me up to about 1,000 different things. Like there's all kinds of cords coming out of me. I feel like the Bionic Man or something, to throw out a really old reference. Then at that point, it's just a game of hurry up and wait. Essentially, I'm just laying there for hours, and my mom is there, and my dad eventually shows up to bring stuff as well. There's nurses constantly coming in to take my blood every other hour. I'm waiting there pretty much all day. Then eventually in the afternoon, they start to run some tests on me after I've been talked to by a doctor. I receive an ultrasound as well as a CT scan, and they don't have any results, but they decide they're going to hold me overnight at this point. During the night, you continue to receive blood draws every other hour, and it's pretty stressful. You can't actually sleep. So in the morning, they come back with results, and they've discovered there's a small blood clot in my lungs, and they send me to a hospital. I forgot to tell you about the ambulance ride. The details are a little foggy. So when I said the hospital earlier, I meant the ER. And eventually, when they found the blood clot in my lung, they actually sent me to a hospital. And I rode in an ambulance. You get strapped down, and they ask you 1,000 questions, and they have to physically pick you up and move you into the hospital. You're not allowed to walk at all. Also, the experience of going to the bathroom is very difficult. You have to have a nurse accompany you, and I'm carrying around this giant machine, walking around the floor in my robe, just having to truck this around. Also, I did something particularly stupid. Now, there's this device they insert into your arm to draw your blood. It was very uncomfortable. I felt it at all times, so I started just trying to adjust it so that I could sleep comfortably, and somehow I
Pulled the thing out.
now, when the nurse arrived in the morning, she was very upset with me for this. And it's constantly it's a rotation of nurses, so there's constantly different ones on shift. Had to meet a new one in the morning and tell her that I ripped this thing out, and she thinks I'm going to be like a problem patient at this point. Now, I go home and start taking this medication, But after a week or so, I feel this piercing feeling in my sort of chest area, and that obviously does not sound good. It starts to intensify, so I decide to go back to the hospital, and I'm put through intake again by another group of very condescending nurses, and we're starting from scratch essentially. And this time they have a lot of trouble finding out what's wrong with me, and I start to think that it's all in my head. It's just my anxiety, even. They think about sending me home at night. Once again, I showed up early in the morning, but they decide because my heart rate is high not to do so. And I actually could have gone home at this point. They had already tested me, they had the result, but they just hadn't found within the result what they needed to find. It kind of sounds like an episode of House, because I think it kind of was. Like, I can imagine they were in a sort of meeting room having to discuss this. So eventually, the next day, after I'm held overnight again, they come back and tell me that they discovered that I was having internal bleeding. This is commonly caused by medications to treat blood clots, but for some reason, nobody was aware of it. Made it sound like they had to do an investigation to discover this, and one doctor had just suddenly realized it. So I had to receive another ultrasound to see the extent of the damage, and I'm actually held overnight again because in the morning they have to check to see if the swelling had reduced essentially. I don't know if I'm getting that correct. But they showed me a picture of what this internal bleeding looked like, and my heart almost stopped because it looked like there was all this blood covering my lung, and it kind of looked like my lung was filling up with the blood. So you can imagine how I felt seeing that. Anyways, I got to be sent home, though they had also discovered I had low platelets. That's a whole different story, and I ended up on steroids for those. But as far as the blood clot and internal bleeding was concerned, they couldn't put me back on the blood clotting medication, obviously, because I had the internal bleeding as a result of it. So I ended up going home with no medication to treat that. But yeah, I just wanted to tell that story today because I thought it was an interesting thing to reflect on. And yeah, I guess the story times have kind of become a genre on this channel. Um, I'll probably continue to do them as well. Chatroom Surfer logging out.